The transport ship Galactic Unity shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, its hull groaning under the stress of rapid deceleration. Through the reinforced viewport, the planet Kepler 442b hung like a bruised jewel against the star-scattered darkness, its surface scarred with the orange glow of plasma bombardments and the sickly green luminescence of Vexi bioweapons. Doctor. Sarah Chen pressed her palm against the cool metal bulkhead, feeling the vibrations of the massive vessel's engines through her bones. Around her, in the cramped troop transport bay, alien soldiers from a dozen different species checked their weapons and armor with the grim efficiency of beings who had seen too much war. The air recyclers couldn't quite mask the smell of fear sweat and ozone from overcharged energy cells. First time in a real war zone, human? The voice belonged to Crickstal, a 7-foot-tall hegemony warrior whose chitinous exoskeleton bore the acid-etched scars of previous battles. His compound eyes glittered with what might have been amusement as he observed Sarah's relatively small frame and the medical kit strapped across her back instead of a plasma rifle. Sarah looked up at the insectoid alien, her dark eyes calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "No," she said simply, adjusting the straps of her field medical pack, "but this is my first time being paid for it." The comment drew a few chuckles from nearby soldiers, but Sarah wasn't trying to be funny. She had grown up in Detroit during the resource wars, where gang violence and corporate security forces had turned the streets into a battlefield. Medical school had been her escape route, funded by a military scholarship that required 8 years of service. She had expected to spend that time in comfortable base hospitals treating routine injuries and issuing physical fitness waivers. She had never expected to volunteer for the front lines of humanity's first interstellar war. Commander Thexara, the Altarian officer in charge of their unit, activated the holographic briefing display with a gesture of her elongated fingers. The image of Kepler 442b expanded, revealing the strategic situation in painful detail. Red zones marked Vexi-controlled territory, which covered nearly 70% of the planet's surface. Blue zones showed Allied positions, small islands of resistance scattered across the continents like drops of water on hot metal. "The situation is deteriorating rapidly," Thexara announced, her melodic voice carrying the weight of command. "The Vexi have established breeding complexes in the major population centers. Our intelligence estimates indicate they are processing approximately 50,000 civilian prisoners daily for biomatter conversion." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had read the reports about Vex's high feeding habits, how they dissolved living tissue with acidic secretions and absorbed the resulting nutrients directly through their skin. The process was slow and agonizing for the victims. The thought of 50,000 people enduring that fate every day made her hands clench unconsciously. "Our mission is to establish a forward medical station at coordinates Lima 77, the commander continued. "The area is nominally under Allied control, but Vexi raiding parties probe our defenses regularly. Casualty rates in the sector are running at approximately 40% per engagement." Crickstal clicked his mandibles together in what Sarah had learned was the equivalent of a grimace. 40%? The tactical computers must be malfunctioning. Those are suicide rates. "The computers are functioning perfectly," Thexara replied coldly. "The Vexi have adapted to our standard military doctrines. They are employing psychological warfare tactics specifically designed to exploit the emotional responses of species capable of empathy. They deliberately wound rather than kill, forcing us to divert resources to medical evacuation and treatment." Sarah raised her hand, ignoring the surprised looks from the alien soldiers. Humans rarely spoke up during military briefings, and when they did, it was usually to ask for clarification of orders, rather than to question strategy. "Commander, what's the current survival rate for wounded personnel who reach medical facilities?" Thexara's golden eyes focused on Sarah with renewed interest. "Approximately 60% for minor wounds, 30% for serious trauma, 5% for critical injuries." "Why do you ask, Dr. Chen?" "Because those numbers are unacceptable," Sarah said, standing up despite the transport's continued shaking. "In civilian trauma centers, we maintain survival rates above 90% even for critical cases. Either your field medics are incompetent or they're not receiving adequate support." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the ship's engines and the distant ping of proximity sensors. Several of the avian soldiers had turned to stare at Sarah, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Challenging a superior officer's assessment of battlefield conditions was not something junior personnel did lightly, especially not humans who are widely regarded as expendable auxiliaries. Crickstal leaned forward, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Careful, little human. You're talking about skilled professionals who have been fighting this war for 3 standard years." Some of us have lost friends because there weren't enough medics to go around. Sarah met his compound gaze without flinching. Then you understand why I'm here. I've treated gunshot wounds in emergency rooms where we had 15 minutes to save a life before the next ambulance arrived. I've performed surgery in hospital corridors during gang warfare, while automatic weapons fire shattered windows 3 floors above us. Your field medics might be skilled, but they're working within a military medical system designed by species who can afford to write off casualties. Humans can't. Commander Thexara studied Sarah with new attention. The Altarians were known for their analytical minds and their ability to recognize patterns that other species missed. Something in the human's tone had clearly caught her interest. Explain what you mean by that, Doctor. Sarah took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. She was about to criticize the medical doctrines of multiple advanced alien civilizations, but the numbers didn't lie. Most of your species have replacement rates that can sustain significant military casualties. The hegemony breeds new warriors in batches of thousands. The Altarians have lifespans measured in centuries, so losing young soldiers doesn't significantly impact your demographic stability. But humans? We have a global population of 8 billion, with reproduction rates that barely maintain replacement levels. Every human life lost is a permanent strategic loss for our species. She gestured toward the holographic display showing the planet below. You said the Vex High are trying to exploit empathy as a weakness. But what if empathy could be turned into a tactical advantage? What if the refusal to abandon wounded personnel wasn't a liability but a force multiplier? The transport ship shuddered again, this time from weapons fire rather than engine stress. Through the viewports, Sarah could see the sleek shapes of Vex's high interceptors diving through the planet's atmosphere, their bioluminescent hulls pulsing with hostile energy. Allied fighter craft rose to meet them, trails of plasma fire crisscrossing the sky like deadly aurora. Cricksdale snorted, a sound like metal grinding against stone. Pretty philosophy, human, but this is war. The only thing that matters is killing the enemy before they kill you. Is it? Sarah challenged. Because from what I've seen in your casualty reports, your current approach isn't working very well. You're losing ground every day, and your soldiers are dying at rates that make my hometown gang wars look like peaceful demonstrations. Before anyone could respond, the ship's emergency klaxons began wailing. Red lights flashed throughout the transport bay as Commander Thexara received an urgent communication through her neural implant. Her golden skin paled to a sickly yellow as she processed the incoming data. Change of plans, she announced, her melodic voice tight with stress. Lima 7. 7 is under heavy attack. Multiple Vex AI assault pods have breached the perimeter. We're being diverted to provide emergency reinforcement. The alien soldiers immediately began checking their weapons and activating their armor systems. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but her hands remained steady as she verified the contents of her medical kit. Trauma shears, hemostatic agents, synthetic blood substitutes, neural stimulators, surgical nanites, and a dozen other tools that might mean the difference between life and death in the coming hours. Dr. Chen? Commander Thexara called out as the transport ship began its final descent toward the planet's surface. You'll be attached to Beta Squad for the initial insertion. Your primary objective is to establish a triage station and provide medical support for wounded personnel. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to engage enemy forces directly. Sarah nodded, but her mind was already racing through contingency plans. She had read the tactical manuals, studied the after-action reports from previous engagements. She knew that medical personnel were supposed to stay behind the front lines, treating wounded soldiers who could be evacuated to the rear areas for proper care. She also knew that doctrine was about to meet reality, and reality had a way of making textbook procedures irrelevant. The transport ship touched down with a bone-jarring impact, its landing thrusters kicking up clouds of alien soil and debris. The rear cargo ramp began lowering immediately, revealing a landscape that looked like something from humanity's worst nightmares. The sky was the color of old blood, stained by smoke from burning installations and the chemical residue of bioweapons. In the distance, towering spires of Vex-high organic architecture pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, their surfaces crawling with activity. Move! 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 Crickstal shouted, his voice electronically amplified by his combat armor's communication system. The alien soldiers poured out of the transport in a disciplined rush, their weapons already tracking potential threats. Sarah followed Beta Squad across the scarred battlefield, her medical kit bouncing against her back with each step. The ground beneath her feet felt wrong somehow, too soft and yielding, as if it had been partially digested by some enormous organism. The smell that rose from the disturbed earth was organic and cloying, like a mixture of rotting fruit and hospital disinfectant. They had covered perhaps 200 meters when the first casualties came into view. The Allied defensive position at Lima 77 had been a reinforced bunker complex built into a natural ridgeline. Now it was a crater filled with twisted metal and the remains of defensive fortifications. Bodies lay scattered across the approaches, some in the recognizable armor of hegemony warriors, others reduced to unidentifiable organic debris by Vex's bioweapons. But what caught Sarah's attention wasn't the dead. It was the wounded. They were everywhere, crawling across the battlefield with injuries that should have been immediately fatal. Soldiers with severed limbs dragging themselves toward cover. Warriors whose armor had been partially dissolved by acid, exposing burned and bleeding flesh beneath. Personnel with massive trauma wounds who should have died from blood loss minutes ago but somehow continued to move. "Jesus Christ," Sarah whispered, forgetting that her communication system would broadcast the comment to the entire squad. "What is it, human?" Crickstall demanded, scanning the area for threats. Sarah was already moving, her medical training overriding every instinct for self-preservation. "They're not dying fast enough." "What?" But Sarah was no longer listening to squad communications. She had reached the first wounded soldier, a Alterian whose left leg had been severed at the knee. The wound should have been fatal from blood loss, but something had been applied to the stump that was keeping the victim alive despite the massive trauma. Sarah knelt beside the injured alien, her hands already working to assess the damage. The soldier's golden skin had turned grey from shock and blood loss, but his breathing was steady and his pulse was detectable. Someone had applied a biofoam tourniquet that was slowly releasing nutrients and stimulants into the bloodstream while simultaneously sealing damaged blood vessels. "Medic," the wounded Alterian whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of weapons fire. "Please." "It hurts." Sarah activated her neural scanner, analyzing the soldier's vital signs and injury profile. What she found made her stomach turn. The biofoam wasn't just keeping him alive. It was keeping him conscious and aware, while his body slowly metabolized the foreign organic compounds. The substance was designed to prevent death while maximizing suffering, turning wounded soldiers into psychological weapons against their own comrades. "Beta Squad, this is Dr. Chen," she said into her communicator, her voice tight with controlled anger. "The Vexahai aren't trying to kill our wounded. They're turning them into torture victims to break our morale." Crickstall's voice crackled through the communication system. "Can you treat them?" Sarah looked across the battlefield at the dozens of wounded soldiers scattered across the approach routes. Each one was calling out for help, their voices creating a chorus of suffering that would haunt the nightmares of any survivor. She understood now why the casualty evacuation rates were so low. No commander could order troops to abandon comrades who were obviously still alive and begging for rescue. "I can do better than that," she said, pulling a combat knife from her medical kit and beginning to cut away the biofoam from the Alterian's wound. "I can make sure they live." The artificial tourniquet came away in chunks, revealing the true extent of the damage beneath. Sarah worked with practiced efficiency, using synthetic blood substitutes to replace lost volume, while surgical nanites sealed damaged vessels and began reconstructing damaged tissue. Her hands moved with the steady precision of someone who had performed similar procedures hundreds of times under far worse conditions. The wounded Alterian's eyes focused on her face as the pain-inducing compounds were flushed from his system. "Thank you," he whispered. Sarah was already moving to the next casualty, a hegemony warrior whose armor had been partially dissolved by acid. "Don't thank me yet," she said grimly. "We're just getting started." Behind her, the sound of approaching Vex-High assault pods began echoing across the battlefield like the drumbeat of an approaching storm. The Vex-High assault pods struck the battlefield with the sound of thunder wrapped in screams. Each organic projectile was roughly the size of a small building, its surface glistening with acidic secretions that allowed it to burrow through solid rock as easily as soft soil. When they breached the surface, they split open like massive flowers, disgorging dozens of combat organisms that moved with the fluid grace of predators born for warfare. Sarah Chen looked up from treating a wounded hegemony soldier just in time to see the first wave of Vexi emerging from their landing pods. They stood nearly 10 feet tall, their bodies a nightmare fusion of insectoid exoskeleton and predatory muscle. Razor-sharp appendages served as both weapons and tools, while clusters of dark eyes provided 360-degree vision that made them nearly impossible to ambush. Worst of all was their intelligence. These weren't mindless drones, but thinking beings who adapted their tactics in real time. "Contact! Contact!" Crickstall's voice crackled through the communication system as Beta Squad took defensive positions among the rubble of the destroyed bunker complex. Multiple hostiles emerging from pod sites. Estimate 40+ enemies in the immediate area. Sarah pressed a self-sealing bandage over the hegemony soldier's acid burns and helped him to a sitting position behind a chunk of twisted metal that would provide cover from small arms fire. "Can you hold a weapon?" she asked. The warrior nodded weakly, accepting the plasma rifle she handed him from a dead comrade. "I can fight, medic. Thank you for giving me the chance." That was the moment Sarah realized something that would change everything about how she approached battlefield medicine. The wounded soldiers she had treated weren't just grateful to be alive, they were angry. Furiously, violently angry at the beings who had tortured them and their comrades. Each person she saved wasn't just a life preserved, it was a warrior returned to the fight with a personal vendetta against the enemy. She was creating an army of survivors who had every reason to fight harder than they ever had before. The first exchange of weapons fire erupted across the battlefield as Beta Squad engaged the advancing HFY. Plasma bolts and kinetic rounds streaked through the air, met by return fire from organic projectiles that burst into clouds of acidic mist on impact. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of energy discharge punctuated by the wet impacts of bioweapons finding their targets. Sarah moved through the chaos with practiced calm, her medical training providing a strange sort of clarity amid the confusion. She had learned long ago that panic was a luxury that killed patients, and her mind automatically catalogued threats and priorities as she worked her way from casualty to casualty. First priority, an Altarian communications specialist whose neural implants had been scrambled by a HFY electromagnetic pulse weapon. Sarah used a portable neural stabilizer to reset the damaged synapses, restoring the soldier's ability to coordinate fire support from orbital platforms. Second priority, 3 hegemony warriors who had been partially paralyzed by HFY neurotoxin darts. Sarah administered broad-spectrum neural stimulants and motor function enhancers, getting them back on their feet and capable of operating heavy weapons within minutes. Third priority, a human sniper from another unit whose left arm had been severed at the elbow by a HFY blade weapon. Sarah used emergency surgical nanites to seal the wound and attached a temporary prosthetic limb that would allow the soldier to continue operating his rifle. "Chen!" Commander Thexara's voice cut through the weapon's fire. "We need to fall back to the secondary defensive line. This position is being overrun." Sarah looked around at the wounded soldiers she had been treating. Standard military doctrine called for medical personnel to evacuate with the retreating forces, leaving critically injured personnel behind, with suicide charges to deny them to the enemy. The alternative was to attempt a fighting withdrawal while carrying stretchers, which significantly slowed movement and increased casualty rates for the entire unit. But Sarah had grown up in a city where retreat meant abandoning your neighborhood to gain control, where every block given up became a launching point for attacks against the people you were supposed to protect. The concept of tactical withdrawal made sense on paper, but it felt like cowardice when applied to people who had trusted you with their lives. "Negative, Commander," she said, surprising herself with the calm authority in her voice. "I'm establishing a mobile triage point. We're taking everyone with us." "That's not tactically feasible," Thexara replied. "The wounded will slow our movement and compromise the entire unit." Sarah looked at the soldiers she had treated, seeing them struggle to stand despite their injuries, their weapons ready despite their pain. An idea began forming in her mind, built from memories of urban warfare where medical personnel had learned to be more than just healers. "What if they don't slow us down?" she asked. "What if they help us fight?" Before anyone could ask what she meant, Sarah began moving among the wounded with renewed purpose. From her medical kit, she retrieved a collection of items that weren't traditionally considered battlefield medicine. Combat stimulants designed for short-term performance enhancement, pain suppressors that could keep a soldier functional despite massive trauma, and adrenaline boosters that could turn injured personnel into berserkers for brief periods. "Dr. Chen," Prickstall warned, recognizing what she was preparing to do. "Those compounds are restricted for emergency use only. The side effects include temporary superhuman strength, enhanced reflexes, and complete suppression of fear responses," Sarah finished. "Which is exactly what we need right now." She knelt beside the first wounded soldier, a Altarian whose leg injuries should have made him unable to walk. "I can give you something that will let you fight for the next hour," she told him honestly. "It will hurt later, and you'll need extended medical treatment afterward. But right now, we can make you stronger and faster than you've ever been in your life. Do you want to try it?" The soldier's golden eyes met hers with grim determination. "Do it." Sarah injected the combat cocktail directly into the soldier's primary circulatory system, watching as the compounds took effect within seconds. The Altarian's pupils dilated, his breathing deepened, and he stood up with fluid grace despite the massive trauma to his leg. When he picked up his weapon, his movements had the deadly precision of a professional killer. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked. The soldier tested his balance and weapon handling, his enhanced reflexes adapting to his temporary physical modifications with startling speed. "I feel like I could kill every Vexai on this planet with my bare hands." "Good," Sarah said, moving to the next casualty. "Let's find out if you're right." Within 10 minutes, she had transformed 8 critically wounded soldiers into a squad of enhanced warriors who moved with predatory efficiency, despite injuries that should have left them bedridden for weeks. The combat stimulants didn't heal their wounds, but they made pain irrelevant and gave their bodies access to strength reserves that normally remain dormant. Commander Fixara watched the transformation with obvious unease. "Doctor, those soldiers need proper medical treatment, not battlefield enhancement drugs." "They'll get proper treatment," Sarah assured her, checking her medical supplies and realizing she had enough stimulants to treat approximately 30 more casualties. "But first, we're going to show the Vexai what happens when you torture human allies." The retreat toward the secondary defensive line became something entirely different under Sarah's direction. Instead of a fighting withdrawal, it became a mobile assault, where wounded soldiers functioned as shock troops supported by the unwounded members of Beta Squad. The enhanced warriors moved with reckless courage, their artificially suppressed fear responses allowing them to take risks that would have been suicidal under normal circumstances. The first Vexai patrol they encountered learned the hard way that wounded humans could be far more dangerous than healthy ones. The enemy had taken positions in a natural choke point, where the retreat route passed through a narrow canyon between 2 rock formations. Standard doctrine would have required a lengthy detour or a costly frontal assault to clear the position. Sarah's enhanced casualties took a different approach. 3 of the stimulant-enhanced soldiers simply charged straight up the canyon walls, their boosted strength and reflexes allowing them to climb nearly vertical surfaces while returning fire with their weapons. The Vexai found themselves under attack from directions they hadn't considered possible, their defensive positions rendered useless by enemies who could literally run up walls. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. When it was over, 12 Vexai lay dead, and the retreat route was clear. Sarah's enhanced soldiers had suffered additional injuries, but none of them had fallen, and their success had provided a massive morale boost to the rest of the unit. "Remarkable," Commander Fixara admitted as they continued moving toward the secondary defensive line. "I've never seen wounded personnel function at that level of effectiveness."
Sarah was already planning the next phase of her improvised medical strategy.
"That's because your medical doctrine assumes that injured soldiers are liabilities. What if they could be assets instead?" They reached the secondary defensive line just as the main Vexai assault began. The position was better fortified than Lima 7-7, built around a series of interlocking bunkers that provided overlapping fields of fire across the approach routes. But the defenses were designed for conventional warfare, not for an enemy that could adapt their tactics in real time. The Vexai had learned from their previous engagements with human forces. Instead of direct assault, they began deploying psychological warfare weapons designed to exploit human emotional responses. Captured Allied personnel were brought forward as living shields, their bodies modified with biotechnological implants that broadcast their pain and terror directly into the neural networks of nearby defenders. Sarah watched through her scope as human soldiers and alien allies alike began to hesitate, their weapons tracking toward enemy positions but unable to fire for fear of hitting the prisoners being used as shields. The Vexai advance continued methodically, using captured personnel as mobile cover, while their assault troops closed the distance to the defensive positions. "We can't shoot," one of the human soldiers whispered over the communication net. "They're using our people as shields." Sarah studied the tactical situation through her medical scanner, analyzing the biotechnological modifications that had been made to the prisoners. The Vexai neural broadcasters were sophisticated pieces of biotechnology, but they had a significant weakness. They required continuous power input from the host's nervous system to function effectively. "Beta Squad, this is Dr. Chen," she said, an idea forming that was either brilliant or completely insane. "I need covering fire for a medical intervention." "What kind of intervention?" Crickstyle demanded. Sarah was already moving, her medical kit reconfigured for a type of treatment she had never attempted under combat conditions. "I'm going to perform emergency neural surgery on prisoners of war while under fire from alien hostiles. That's impossible."
"No," Sarah said, checking her surgical nanites and neural stabilizers.
"That's Tuesday." She sprinted across the open ground between the defensive positions and the advancing Vexai. her enhanced soldiers providing covering fire that kept enemy attention focused away from her approach. The prisoners were arranged in a line approximately 50 meters from the alien positions, their modified neural systems broadcasting waves of pain and terror that made it difficult for defenders to concentrate on target acquisition. Sarah reached the first prisoner, a human soldier whose skull had been partially opened to install a HFY neural broadcaster. The device was actively stimulating his pain centers while simultaneously amplifying his emotional distress. Under normal circumstances, removing it would require hours of delicate surgery in a sterile operating environment. Sarah had about 30 seconds before the HFY realized what she was doing and focused their fire on her position. She activated her surgical nanites and neural mapping system, identifying the exact placement of the alien technology within the prisoner's brain. The broadcaster had been installed with typical HFY efficiency, its organic components interfacing directly with the victim's nervous system. Removing it without causing permanent damage would require precision that bordered on the miraculous. Fortunately, Sarah Chen had spent years performing miracles in Detroit emergency rooms. The nanites went to work with microscopic precision, severing the connections between the alien device and the prisoner's neural tissue, while simultaneously repairing the damage caused by its installation. Sarah's hands moved with steady confidence, guided by real-time feedback from her medical scanners and years of experience with emergency neurosurgery. The broadcaster came free with a wet sucking sound, immediately ceasing its transmission of pain and terror. The freed prisoner looked up at Sarah with eyes that were suddenly clear and focused. "Can you fight?" she asked, offering him a plasma rifle from her emergency medical supplies. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice steady despite the massive trauma he had endured. Sarah moved to the next prisoner, her surgical nanites already adapting to the specific configuration of HFY neural technology. Each extraction became faster and more efficient as her equipment learned the optimal techniques for removing the alien devices. By the time the HFY realized what was happening and began concentrating fire on her position, Sarah had freed 8 prisoners and turned them into fresh reinforcements for the defensive line. The psychological warfare tactic that should have paralyzed the human defenders had been turned against the attackers. The battle that followed would be remembered as the moment when humanity announced its arrival as a major power in galactic warfare, not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but through the simple refusal to abandon their own people, no matter how hopeless the situation appeared. The news of what had happened at the secondary defensive line spread through the Galactic Coalition forces faster than plasma fire. Within hours, every military communication network in the sector was buzzing with reports that seemed too incredible to be true. A single human medic had single-handedly neutralized a HFY psychological warfare operation, freed 8 prisoners under direct enemy fire, and turned a potential defeat into a strategic victory.
High Command's initial response was skepticism.
The tactical reports didn't match any known medical procedures, and the casualty figures seemed impossibly low for the type of engagement that had been described. 3 different intelligence services opened investigations to determine if the reports were the result of combat stress, communication errors, or deliberate misinformation. Dr. Sarah Chen was unaware of the controversy she had created. She was too busy dealing with the consequences of her improvised battlefield medicine techniques. The soldiers she had enhanced with combat stimulants were beginning to crash as the drugs wore off. Their suppressed pain responses were returning with interest, and several were experiencing dangerous cardiac arrhythmias as their cardiovascular systems struggled to process the chemical cocktails she had administered. Under normal circumstances, they would need immediate evacuation to full medical facilities for treatment and recovery. Unfortunately, the nearest medical facility was 300 kilometers away, and the HFY controlled most of the territory between their current position and safety. Sarah had created a new problem. She had approximately 30 soldiers who were alive because of her interventions, but who would die without continued medical support. Moving them would be difficult and dangerous. Leaving them behind was unthinkable. The standard military solution would be to request emergency evacuation and hope that air support could extract the casualties before enemy forces overran their position. But Sarah had learned something important about human nature during her years in Detroit emergency medicine. People were capable of far more than they believed possible when their survival depended on it. The question wasn't whether her patients could handle continued combat operations. The question was whether she could keep them alive long enough to develop new treatment protocols. Dr. Chen, Commander Fexara approached her improvised medical station with obvious concern. "I need to know the combat readiness status of your enhanced personnel. High Command is requesting immediate tactical assessment." Sarah looked up from monitoring the vital signs of a hegemony warrior whose chitin plates had been partially dissolved by HFY acid weapons. She had managed to stabilize his condition using synthetic carapace grafts and biocompatible adhesives, but he would need extensive regenerative therapy to fully recover. Define combat readiness, she said, adjusting the warrior's pain medication dosage. Can they fight? Can they fight now, or can they fight for the next week? Sarah asked. Because those are very different questions with very different answers. Thexara's golden skin took on a pale shade that indicated stress. High Command believes the Vexai are massing for a major offensive. Our forces in this sector may need to hold position for up to 10 standard days before reinforcements can arrive. Sarah felt her stomach sink. 10 days was far beyond the safe operational window for the combat stimulants she had administered. Her enhanced soldiers would be lucky to remain functional for another 48 hours without suffering permanent physiological damage, unless she could develop new protocols. Commander, I need to request emergency medical supplies, Sarah said, her mind already working through the possibilities. And I need authorization to implement experimental treatment procedures under combat conditions. What kind of experimental procedures? Sarah looked across the defensive perimeter at the soldiers she had treated.
They were still fighting, still functional, still alive when they should have been dead.
But keeping them that way would require pushing medical science into uncharted territory. I want to try something that's never been attempted before, she said. I want to see if we can create a sustainable combat enhancement protocol that allows wounded personnel to remain effective for extended periods. That sounds extremely dangerous. Everything we're doing here is extremely dangerous, Sarah replied. The question is whether we want to be dangerous to ourselves or dangerous to the enemy. The emergency medical supplies arrived 6 hours later, delivered by a high-speed drone that had to evade 3 separate Vex-High interceptor patrols to reach their position. Along with the standard trauma medicines and surgical equipment, Sarah had requested several items that weren't normally found in battlefield medical kits: experimental neural interface hardware, prototype bioenhancement drugs still in clinical trials, and a portable genetic sequencing laboratory. She was about to attempt something that would either revolutionize military medicine or kill every patient she tried it on. The first volunteer was Sergeant Marcus Webb, a human soldier whose left leg had been severely damaged by a Vex-High bioweapon. The injury should have required amputation and months of rehabilitation. Instead, Sarah proposed to use experimental regenerative nanites combined with neural interface technology to create a temporary biological prosthetic. Doc, Webb said as Sarah prepared the injection protocols. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I need to know the risks. Sarah met his eyes with complete honesty. There's approximately a 30% chance this will work as intended. There's a 40% chance it will work partially but cause complications that require extended medical treatment. There's a 20% chance it will fail completely and make your injury worse. And there's a 10% chance it will kill you. Webb considered this for a moment. What happens if I don't try it? Your combat effectiveness drops to 0 within the next 12 hours, and you become a liability that endangers the entire unit. And if it works, you become something that's never existed before, a soldier who's been medically optimized for sustained combat operations. Webb extended his arm for the injection. Do it. The regenerative nanites went to work immediately, analyzing the damaged tissue in his leg and beginning reconstruction at the cellular level. But instead of simply repairing the injury, Sarah had programmed them to improve upon the original biological structure: enhanced muscle fibers, reinforced bone density, improved nerve conduction, and increased vascular efficiency. The neural interface hardware created a direct connection between Webb's nervous system and the nanites, allowing him conscious control over the enhancement process. He could adjust his strength, speed, and reflexes in real time based on tactical requirements. Within 30 minutes, Webb was standing on a leg that was stronger than the original had ever been.
How does it feel?
Sarah asked, monitoring his vital signs for any indication of rejection or adverse reaction. Webb took a few experimental steps, then broke into a run that would have been impossible for an unenhanced human. It feels like I could run through a wall. You probably could, Sarah said. But let's test the combat applications first. The testing came sooner than expected. Vex-A reconnaissance units had been probing the defensive perimeter throughout the day, and their latest incursion was more aggressive than previous attempts. A dozen alien warriors emerged from concealment simultaneously, their bioweapons targeting the human positions with coordinated precision. Webb engaged the first Vex-High he encountered with movements that defied normal human limitations. His enhanced leg provided explosive acceleration that allowed him to close the distance before the alien could bring its weapons to bear. When they collided, the impact shattered the Vexhi's exoskeleton and sent the creature flying backward into a rock formation. "Jesus," one of the other soldiers whispered over the communication net. "What did you do to him?" Sarah was already preparing the next round of enhancements. She had proven the basic concept worked. Now she needed to scale it up to create an entire unit of enhanced warriors. "I made him better," she said simply. Over the next 6 hours, Sarah performed experimental enhancements on every soldier in their unit who volunteered for the procedure. Each enhancement was customized based on the individual's injuries, physical capabilities, and tactical role. Snipers received enhanced visual acuity and improved fine motor control. Heavy weapon specialists got increased strength and stabilized cardiovascular systems that could handle the stress of operating powered armor. Communications personnel received neural interfaces that allowed them to process multiple data streams simultaneously. The transformation was remarkable. Soldiers who should have been evacuated for medical treatment became more effective than they had ever been before their injuries. The unit's combat effectiveness didn't just recover, it increased exponentially. But Sarah's innovations had attracted attention from sources she hadn't expected. Dr. Chen, Commander Thexara, approached her medical station with an expression of barely controlled excitement. "I've received communication from High Command. You're being reassigned." Sarah looked up from calibrating the neural enhancement protocols for Altarian communications specialist. "Reassigned where?" "The Galactic Medical Council has requested your immediate transfer to their research facility on Core Station Alpha. They want to study your enhancement techniques and implement them across all Coalition forces." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the planet's atmosphere. She had read about the Galactic Medical Council's research facilities. They were places where medical theory was more important than patient welfare, where experimental procedures were tested on volunteers who rarely survived to report the results. "What if I refuse the transfer?" Thexara's expression became carefully neutral. "That would be inadvisable. The Medical Council has significant influence over military medical policy. Refusing their request could result in court-martial proceedings." Sarah looked across the defensive perimeter at the soldiers she had enhanced. They were fighting with effectiveness that bordered on the supernatural, holding positions that should have been overrun hours ago. But they were also dependent on her continued medical support to maintain their enhancements without suffering permanent damage. "How long do I have before the transfer takes effect?" "You're scheduled for evacuation in 18 hours. Sarah made a decision that would change the course of the war and establish her reputation as either a medical genius or a dangerous renegade. "Commander, I need to speak with every enhanced soldier in our unit, immediately." "What for?" "Because I'm about to give them a choice that will determine whether they remain enhanced warriors or return to being ordinary soldiers." She gathered her patients in the main bunker, looking at faces that had been transformed by her experimental procedures. These weren't just soldiers anymore. They were test subjects for medical techniques that existed nowhere else in known space. "In 18 hours, I'm being transferred to a Galactic Medical Council research facility," she told them honestly. "They want to study the enhancement procedures I've developed and potentially implement them across all Coalition forces." Sergeant Webb spoke for the group. "What does that mean for us?" "It means you have a choice to make. You can allow the Medical Council to study your enhancements, which will probably involve extensive testing and possible surgical procedures to determine how the nanites and neural interfaces function. Or you can come with me." "Come with you where?" Sarah smiled grimly. "I'm going to establish an independent medical research facility. Somewhere the Medical Council can't interfere with patient care or military effectiveness. But it means leaving the Coalition military and becoming something new." "What kind of something new?" "Mercenaries," Sarah said simply. "Enhanced soldiers for hire, working for whoever pays best and treats wounded personnel as assets instead of liabilities." The silence that followed was broken by Webb's laughter. "Doc, are you asking us to desert from the Coalition military to become enhanced space pirates? I'm asking if you want to continue being enhanced soldiers, or if you want to become medical test subjects." The vote was unanimous. The stolen Coalition transport ship Medical Priority dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Terminus Nebula, its emergency beacon broadcasting distress signals that would attract salvage crews, pirates and worse to their location within hours. But Sarah Chen wasn't planning to stay long enough for rescue or capture. In the 18 days since their dramatic departure from Kepler, 442b, her makeshift crew of enhanced soldiers had learned that deserting from the Galactic Coalition military was significantly easier than finding employment as independent contractors. Legitimate mercenary companies wouldn't hire deserters, regardless of their combat effectiveness. Criminal organizations were interested, but their idea of medical enhancement usually involved interrogation drugs and biological weapons. Sarah needed to find clients who valued enhanced soldiers enough to pay premium rates but who weren't concerned about the legal status of their contractors. The answer, she had realized, was other deserters. Dr. Chen, Sergeant Webb called from the navigation station. We're picking up multiple signals from inside the nebula. Looks like there's a significant settlement about 6 million kilometers from our current position. Sarah studied the sensor readings on the main display. The nebula provided natural concealment from Coalition patrol ships, but it also made long-range scanning nearly impossible. Whatever was out there had chosen their location specifically to avoid detection. Any idea what kind of settlement? The energy signatures suggest heavy industrial equipment and defensive installations, Webb reported, but the communication protocols aren't matching any known coalition or independent planetary systems. Rogue colonies, Sarah said with satisfaction. Perfect. Rogue colonies were settlements established by groups who had withdrawn from galactic civilization for various reasons: political dissidents, religious separatists, criminal organizations, or simply people who preferred to live without government oversight. They were typically well-armed, suspicious of outsiders, and desperate for medical personnel who could treat injuries without reporting them to law enforcement agencies. In other words, ideal clients for an independent military medical unit. The settlement turned out to be larger than Sarah had expected. Built around a massive asteroid that had been hollowed out and converted into a shipyard, the colony supported approximately 50,000 inhabitants, who made their living by providing services that couldn't be obtained through legal channels. Ship modifications that violated safety regulations, weapons that had been banned by galactic treaties, medical procedures that skirted the boundaries of ethical guidelines. Sarah felt immediately at home. Unknown vessel, this is Terminus Station Traffic Control, a gravelly voice announced over the communication system. State your business or alter course immediately. Terminus Station, this is the medical vessel Priority, Sarah replied. We're an independent medical unit seeking employment, requesting permission to dock for negotiations. There was a long pause before traffic control responded. Medical unit? What kind of medical unit? The kind that doesn't ask questions and doesn't file reports. Docking Bay 7, welcome to Terminus. The station's interior was a maze of converted asteroid tunnels connected by makeshift corridors that had been added over decades of expansion. The artificial gravity was inconsistent. The air recyclers couldn't quite eliminate the smell of industrial solvents and biological waste, and the lighting flickered unpredictably. Sarah had seen worse conditions in Detroit emergency rooms. Their contact turned out to be Dr. Ezra Blackwood, a human physician who had fled Coalition space after his medical license was revoked for conducting unauthorized genetic experiments. He was thin and pale, with the nervous energy of someone who had spent too many years looking over his shoulder for law enforcement agents. Dr. Chen, he said, examining the medical equipment she had brought with her from Kepler. 442b. I have to admit, when you said you were an independent medical unit, I was expecting battlefield surgeons and emergency trauma specialists. This equipment suggests something significantly more sophisticated. Sarah gestured toward Webb and the other enhanced soldiers who had accompanied her to the meeting. We specialize in combat enhancement procedures, temporary and permanent modifications that improve soldier effectiveness while treating combat injuries. Blackwood's eyes widened as he realized what he was looking at. These are enhanced personnel? I assumed they were standard military contractors.
They were, Sarah said.
Until I made them better. Show me. Sarah nodded to Webb, who demonstrated his enhanced capabilities by lifting a piece of equipment that should have required 4 people to move. The regenerative nanites in his leg had not only repaired the original injury, but had continued improving his physical structure over the weeks since the initial treatment. Remarkable, Blackwood whispered. How long can they maintain this level of enhancement? Indefinitely, with proper medical support, Sarah replied. The nanites are self-replicating and self-improving. Each enhancement makes the subject more capable of supporting additional modifications. Blackwood leaned forward with obvious interest. What would you need to establish a full enhancement facility here at Terminus? Medical laboratory space, surgical equipment, access to rare biological compounds, and a steady supply of clients who want to become more than they were. I can provide all of that, Blackwood said eagerly. But I want something in return. I want to learn your techniques. Sarah had expected this request. Blackwood's reputation suggested he was brilliant but ethically flexible. Exactly the kind of partner she needed for what she was planning. Partnership agreement, she said. You provide the resources, I provide the techniques. We split the profits and share research data. Done. Within a month, the Terminus Enhancement Clinic had become the most sought-after medical facility in the rogue colonies. Word spread quickly through the criminal underworld that there was a place where soldiers could be transformed into superhuman warriors, where lost limbs could be replaced with improved mechanical alternatives, and where death from combat injuries was no longer inevitable. The clients came from across the galaxy: pirates seeking enhanced crews, mercenary companies wanting improved soldiers, revolutionaries needing fighters who could match coalition military technology. Sarah treated them all with the same professional competence she had brought to emergency rooms in Detroit, asking no questions about their backgrounds or intentions. But her enhanced soldiers were becoming something more than just medical experiments. The permanent base at Terminus allowed Sarah to refine her enhancement procedures and develop new techniques that went far beyond simple combat improvements. Neural interfaces allowed enhanced personnel to share tactical information instantly across units. Biological modifications provided immunity to common battlefield toxins and diseases. Regenerative systems allowed rapid healing from injuries that would have been permanently disabling. Most importantly, the enhanced soldiers developed an intense loyalty to Sarah and each other that transcended normal military unit cohesion. They had been transformed from ordinary people into something unprecedented in galactic history, and they understood that their continued existence depended on protecting the person who had made that transformation possible. Dr. Chen. Webb approached her in the main laboratory where she was working on neural enhancement protocols for a new client. "We've received an interesting job offer." Sarah looked up from the genetic sequencing equipment she had been calibrating. "What kind of job offer?"
Coalition military contract.
"They want to hire us as medical contractors for a special operation. The same coalition military that has arrest warrants outstanding for all of us." Webb grinned. "That's what makes it interesting. They're willing to offer full pardons and reinstatement if we help them with a problem they can't solve using conventional methods." Sarah felt a familiar chill. "What kind of problem?" "The Vexai have developed new biological weapons that are specifically designed to counter coalition medical technology. Standard treatment protocols aren't working, and casualty rates are approaching critical levels. They want us to develop countermeasures?" "They want you to develop countermeasures," Webb corrected. The enhanced soldiers would be deployed as a test unit to evaluate the effectiveness of new treatment protocols under combat conditions. Sarah considered the offer carefully. Returning to coalition space would mean exposure to arrest and prosecution for desertion, theft of military property, and unauthorized medical experimentation, but it would also mean access to resources and research data that weren't available in the rogue colonies. Most importantly, it would mean the chance to prove that her enhancement techniques could change the course of the war against the Vexai. What are the mission parameters? 6-month deployment to the Vexai front lines. Primary objective is developing effective medical countermeasures to new enemy biological weapons. Secondary objective is evaluating the combat effectiveness of enhanced personnel in prolonged operations. And if we succeed, full pardons, retroactive recognition of our enhancement procedures as legitimate medical techniques, and integration of enhanced soldiers as a permanent component of coalition forces. Sarah made her decision. Send a reply. "We accept the contract, but with conditions." "What conditions?" "We operate as an independent unit under my medical command. No interference from coalition medical authorities. Complete access to captured Vexai biological samples and combat data, and guaranteed safe passage back to Terminus if the partnership doesn't work out." Webb nodded approvingly. "You want to go back to war?" "No," Sarah said, looking at the enhanced soldiers who had gathered around their conversation. "I want to finish what we started." The journey back to coalition space took 3 weeks, during which Sarah used the time to perform additional enhancements on her soldiers. By the time they reached the staging area for their deployment, each member of her unit was capable of feats that defied standard biological limitations. The coalition military officials who met them at the docking facility were clearly unprepared for what they encountered. Enhanced soldiers moved with predatory grace, their modified physiology obvious to anyone with basic medical knowledge. Their equipment had been customized to take advantage of their improved capabilities, and their unit cohesion was tighter than anything found in standard military formations. Dr. Chen, the coalition medical director, introduced himself with obvious nervousness. "I'm Dr. Harrison Kyle, Director of Military Medical Research. I'll be your liaison during this deployment." Sarah studied Kyle's credentials and background through her neural interface. Brilliant researcher, limited combat experience, politically connected but professionally conservative. Exactly the kind of person who would oppose her enhancement techniques on philosophical grounds while desperately needing their practical benefits. Dr. Kyle, she replied formally. I assume you've reviewed our medical protocols and enhancement procedures? I have, Kyle said carefully. They're unconventional. They're effective. That remains to be determined. Sarah smiled coldly. No, Dr. Kyle. That was determined 6 months ago when my enhanced soldiers held positions that conventional forces couldn't maintain. The only question now is whether the coalition military is ready to accept that its medical doctrine needs fundamental revision. The conversation was interrupted by emergency klaxons as the base came under attack. Vex's Haid raiders had penetrated the outer perimeter, and casualties were mounting faster than conventional medical facilities could handle them. Sarah's enhanced soldiers moved toward the emergency with purposeful efficiency. It was time to prove that enhanced humans could not only fight alongside galactic civilization's greatest warriors, they could surpass them. The final battle for humanity's place in galactic civilization began at 034. 7 hours on a world whose name had been erased from star charts after the Vex High turned it into a biological weapons testing ground. Coalition High Command called it Operation Final Stand, though the soldiers fighting there knew it by a different name, the place where everything changed. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the command bunker, watching tactical displays that showed the impossible. Her enhanced soldiers weren't just holding their positions against Vex High assault forces, they were advancing. For the first time in 3 years of war, coalition forces were pushing the enemy back across territory they had held since the early days of the conflict. Casualty reports, she requested from the Medical Coordination Center. 17 wounded, no fatalities, came the reply. All wounded personnel have been stabilized and returned to combat status within 4 hours of injury. Dr. Harrison Kyle, who had spent the past 6 months arguing against Sarah's enhancement protocols, stared at the numbers in disbelief. Those casualty rates are impossible. No military unit can sustain 97% combat effectiveness after 6 months of continuous combat operations.
Conventional units can't, Sarah agreed.
Enhanced units can. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Sarah had spent months refining her enhancement procedures, developing new protocols that pushed the boundaries of medical science and human biology. Her soldiers now carried regenerative nanites that could repair injuries in real time, neural interfaces that allowed tactical coordination beyond anything previously achieved, and biological modifications that made them faster, stronger, and more resilient than any warrior in galactic history. But the real breakthrough hadn't been technological, it had been psychological. Enhanced soldiers didn't just fight differently, they thought differently. The knowledge that they could recover from injuries that would permanently disable ordinary personnel made them willing to take risks that conventional forces couldn't consider. The neural interfaces that allowed instant communication and shared tactical awareness created unit cohesion that transcended individual survival instincts. Most importantly, they fought with the absolute confidence of people who knew that their medic would bring them back from the brink of death, no matter how severe their injuries. Dr. Chen. Commander Thexara approached with a communication pad containing orders from Coalition High Command. You need to see this. Sarah read the message with growing amazement. The Galactic Council, the governing body that had barely acknowledged humanity's existence 2 years earlier, was offering her something unprecedented. The position of Director of Military Medical Research for all Coalition forces, with unlimited resources and authority to implement her enhancement protocols across every military unit in known space. They want to make enhancement procedures standard for all Coalition personnel, Thexara explained. Every soldier, every naval crew member, every support specialist would receive basic modifications with advanced enhancements available for specialized combat roles. Sarah looked through the reinforced viewport at the battlefield where her soldiers continued their impossible advance against Vex-High positions. The enemy that had seemed unstoppable 3 years ago was retreating in confusion, unable to adapt to tactics they had never encountered before. What's the catch? Sarah asked. You would have to accept integration into the coalition military hierarchy. No more independent operations, no more rogue colonies, no more mercenary contracts. You would become part of the official command structure. Sarah considered the offer carefully. Official recognition would mean resources beyond her wildest dreams, the ability to enhance millions of soldiers instead of dozens, and the chance to establish enhancement procedures as standard medical practice throughout galactic civilization. It would also mean giving up the independence that had made her innovations possible. I need to discuss this with my unit, she said finally. Sarah gathered her enhanced soldiers in the bunker that had become their informal meeting place during quiet moments between battles. These weren't just her patients anymore. They were her partners in developing something that had never existed before in galactic history. Coalition High Command has offered us full integration into the military command structure, she told them. Official recognition of our enhancement procedures, unlimited resources for development, and the chance to transform every Coalition soldier into enhanced personnel. Sergeant Webb, who now served as her senior tactical advisor, spoke for the group. What would that mean for us? It means we become part of the system instead of operating outside it. We follow orders instead of choosing our own missions. We save lives because we're ordered to, not because we decide it's the right thing to do. And if we refuse? Sarah smiled grimly. We go back to being medical mercenaries. We help whoever pays us, we work in the shadows, and we continue developing enhancements for small groups instead of entire armies. The discussion that followed lasted for hours. Enhanced soldiers debated the merits of official recognition versus operational independence, the benefits of unlimited resources versus the freedom to choose their own clients. But in the end, the decision came down to a single question. What would allow them to save the most lives? Dr. Chen, Webb said finally. We've made our choice. What choice? We choose you.
Sarah felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. What do you mean?
We mean that we don't care about official recognition or unlimited resources or integration into command structures, Webb explained.
We care about working with someone who sees wounded soldiers as people worth saving instead of statistics to be managed. But the resources will come with restrictions and oversight and committees that second-guess every decision you make, another soldier interrupted. We've seen how the coalition medical establishment operates. They'll take your techniques and turn them into standardized procedures that eliminate everything that makes them effective. Sarah looked around at the faces of soldiers who had trusted her with their lives and their humanity. Each one had been transformed by her enhancements, but they had also transformed her understanding of what military medicine could accomplish. So, what do you recommend?
We recommend that you tell Coalition High Command to keep their job offer,
Webb said with a grin. And we recommend that you accept a better offer instead. What better offer? The offer to become the most famous medical mercenary in galactic history. Sarah laughed, despite the seriousness of the situation.
And how exactly do we become famous mercenaries? By winning this war, Webb said simply.
Not by following orders from coalition politicians, but by proving that enhanced soldiers can accomplish things that conventional forces never could. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Coalition intelligence had identified the location of the primary Vex High Command complex, a massive biological structure that coordinated enemy operations across multiple star systems. Previous attempts to destroy it had failed because conventional assault forces couldn't penetrate the defensive systems that surrounded the facility. But conventional assault forces had never included enhanced soldiers who could perform medical miracles under fire. Dr. Chen, the mission briefing officer, explained the tactical situation with obvious pessimism. The target is protected by bioengineered defensive organisms that release toxins capable of killing most known species within minutes of exposure. Previous assault teams have suffered 100% casualties before reaching the outer perimeter. Sarah studied the reconnaissance data, analyzing the biological defenses through her enhanced neural interface. The Vex High had indeed created defensive systems that were specifically designed to kill conventional soldiers. But they had never encountered soldiers whose biology had been modified to resist toxins, whose nanites could neutralize biological weapons, and whose neural interfaces allowed real-time adaptation to new threats. How many enhanced soldiers would you need for a successful assault? The briefing officer asked. 12, Sarah said confidently. 12 soldiers to assault a facility that defeated 3 full battalions. 12 enhanced soldiers with proper medical support. The assault on the Vex High Command Complex became the stuff of legend throughout galactic space. Enhanced soldiers moved through defensive perimeters that should have been impenetrable, their modified physiology allowing them to function in environments that would have killed ordinary personnel within seconds. When they sustained injuries from enemy weapons, Sarah's advanced medical techniques kept them functional and fighting. The battle lasted 18 hours. When it ended, the Vex High command structure had been completely destroyed. Their ability to coordinate large-scale operations had been eliminated, and the war had effectively ended. Coalition casualty reports listed 12 wounded, no fatalities. Vex High casualty reports were never filed because there were no survivors to file them. The victory celebrations throughout Coalition space lasted for months. Humanity, which had been regarded as a minor species barely worthy of inclusion in galactic civilization, had produced the warriors who won the most important war in recorded history. Enhanced soldiers became the subject of news reports, documentary films, and academic studies. Dr. Sarah Chen became a household name on thousands of worlds. But she wasn't interested in fame or recognition. She was interested in the message that arrived 6 months after the victory, transmitted through channels that only enhanced soldiers would recognize. Dr. Chen, the message began. This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the independent vessel Medical Necessity. I'm transmitting from the Outer Rim territories, where we've encountered a new species that's being systematically exterminated by unknown aggressors. They're requesting medical assistance for their wounded, but conventional medicine can't treat their physiology. Sarah smiled as she read the rest of the message. My crew consists of 67 enhanced soldiers who learnt about your techniques through underground medical networks. We're requesting permission to join your unit for this mission. She looked around at Webb and the other original members of her team. It looks like we're not the only enhanced medical unit operating outside official channels. How many other units are out there? Webb asked. Sarah activated her neural interface and began scanning communication networks for signals that matched the patterns used by enhanced personnel. Within minutes, she had identified dozens of independent medical units operating throughout galactic space, all using variations of the enhancement techniques she had developed. Enough to change everything, she said with satisfaction. The message she sent in reply was broadcast simultaneously to every enhanced medical unit she could identify. This is Dr. Sarah Chen aboard the Medical Priority. All enhanced medical personnel are invited to join a new organization, the Independent Medical Corps. Our mission is to provide advanced medical treatment to anyone who needs it, regardless of political affiliation, species, or ability to pay. Our only requirement is that members swear to uphold the principles that no one dies if we can prevent it, no one suffers if we can heal them, and no one fights alone if we can stand beside them. Welcome to the future of military medicine.
The response was immediate and overwhelming.
Enhanced soldiers from across the galaxy began converging on Sarah's position, bringing with them new techniques, advanced equipment, and stories of medical miracles performed in combat zones that conventional forces had written off as hopeless. Within a year, the Independent Medical Corps had grown to include over 10,000 enhanced personnel operating from mobile medical facilities that could deploy anywhere in known space within hours of receiving a distress call. Sarah Chen had started as a single combat medic trying to save wounded soldiers on a forgotten battlefield. She had become the founder of an organization that redefined what military medicine could accomplish and what enhanced humans were capable of achieving. The galaxy had learned something important. Never underestimate a human with healing hands, a warrior's heart, and the absolute refusal to let anyone die on their watch, especially when that human has the resources to turn ordinary soldiers into legends, and the determination to prove that enhanced humanity could become the galaxy's most powerful force for both war and healing. Dr. Sarah Chen had become exactly what the galaxy needed, a medic who understood that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with the simple refusal to abandon hope in the face of impossible odds. And in a galaxy full of dangers that conventional forces couldn't handle, that refusal had become humanity's greatest weapon.